Without further ado, the final short talk of the afternoon will be on museum sustainability in the 21st century. Today, the ROM is playing a global role in leading a new vision of institutional sustainability, including reducing the energy capacity of its very own museum building right here, which is critically important as we aim to reduce the energy consumption of the building and mitigate the impacts of climate change. Soren Brothers and Heidi Sobel, whose work strives to care for some of Ontario's most treasured collections and its environment, will explore innovations driving these changes. Soren Brothers is the Alan and Helene Schiff Curator of Climate Change here at the ROM. He's also an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. Soren's research examines the effects of climate change on lakes and how changes in aquatic systems influence their greenhouse gas emissions. More broadly, he's interested in understanding how feedback loops and the transdisciplinary study of lakes can help us better understand and predict global tipping points that may accelerate anthropogenic climate change. Heidi Sobel is ROM's Senior Manager of Conservation. Heidi has worked throughout North America, including the National Gallery of Canada, as well as in private practice conserving paintings in Halifax, Nova Scotia. In her current role, Heidi works across the museum, both in art and culture and natural history, safeguarding our priceless collections. So welcome, Heidi, and welcome, Soren.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you all of you for being here. Given the time, I think we're just going to jump straight in. Heidi and I were really excited to just start by talking about maybe giving a bit of an idea of what a 21st century museum is, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but for those who aren't familiar with the term, we can think about this as being a shift away from the way that museums have been historically maybe operated and conceptualized by the public as these kind of dusty old institutions that become places of maybe authoritative, sort of didactic knowledge transmission, taking objects from places and having them in cabinets to look and tell you what you should think about them. And it's moving towards more of a concept of community engagement and bringing objects to communities, much in the way that the last presentation was even speaking to, actually many of the presentations today, of this kind of engagement. And you know, there's whole books about this. I'm not going to dive into it in too much detail, but I wanted to frame it in an interesting way that we usually think about it as a concept, but when we talk about sustainability, we're also looking at the constructs of our buildings as well as being these older infrastructures that are kind of going along with this shift. So part of the change that we're seeing with museums globally right now is this idea of institutional accountability coming to the foreground and being able to say, you know, if we're going to talk about climate change, we're going to talk about our role to our communities, to our society, to the planet. What are we going to do? How are we going to kind of walk that talk? A lot of museums have been hiring sustainability officers, for instance, around the world. One of the first conversations I had actually when I started here was with Bella Serino, who's been the sustainability officer for the Tate Modern Museum in London for maybe 15, 20 years. So these are people whose job is to just focus on reducing the carbon footprint, increasing sustainable operating practices in facilities of museums. Another thing that we've seen happen in a lot of museums recently around the world is formation of green teams. So these are groups of staff who are looking at how they're actually changing the museum practices internally between departments. And I'm going to come back to that in the ROM case. At the higher level, we can also think about reductions in carbon footprints, waste generation. These are, again, different kind of practices and changes in policies in a lot of cases that museums are undertaken. For instance, I mentioned Bella Serino at the Tate Modern. She told me that they actually had a carbon task force that ended up working with senior management to look at how they reduce their carbon footprints. And they stopped having any meetings that senior management would take flying within England, for instance, when they saw the carbon footprint of that. So you have these different levels, whereas their green team would be more focused on, for instance, changing out plastic straws and having more sustainable procedures in their cafeterias. So we have these different levels of thinking within museums. Within the ROM, so I started here just over 3 years ago, fall 2021. And already there has been a legacy of sustainability at the ROM that I could see right away. So, I started engaging pretty quickly with the facilities workers here, Ron Spear, Brian, and seeing how they'd already been changing over LED lights. They've already had these really high-level installations that they've been introducing. And a lot of this work is not really necessarily even sustainability oriented from a global climate kind of perspective, but just even saving museums' budgets. I mean, having better insulation, having more efficient technologies is just cheaper to run. It's a lot of energy goes into these huge institutions that are often very cavernous too, especially in a climate such as this. Our green team at the museum was formed in 2018 by Antonio Guidotti, our ROM technician, entomologist, and Mark Peck, who's a recently retired ornithologist here. It now has 29 members, spanning 9 departments of the museum. So it's really nice to think about it as something that's not just one person or one group of people who think that this is an important thing, and I'm going to again come back to this, but it's how it really kind of creates a conversation for people working across these different departments and across different areas of the museum, whether it's working with the public, working in marketing, working in exhibitions. All of these different areas are now communicating and thinking about how do we kind of change the culture and the practice of these. And again, this work had already begun before I got here. And a lot of the things that the Green Team had done, they were really instrumental in waste reduction measures. A lot of people don't really consider how much waste can be produced by exhibitions and the touring impact. These are really kind of things that in a well-run museum, they go smoothly and you don't kind of see any of that outside, the walls being constructed and deconstructed. But a lot of people working in this situation and working in these museums are seeing it and talking about it and trying to find solutions to these kinds of problems. And one of the other things that we've done actually now with the Green Team is integrating it with museum onboarding. So this only started in the last 6 months or so, but now every time there's new hires coming into the museum, every couple weeks we actually have a presentation where we talk about the Green Team, we talk about the progress that it's made and establishing this culture within and across the museum. One other thing that I wanted to point out, and also thinking about the kind of spanning of different people kind of working together at different scales, is this picture here. Some of you may have seen the ROM's green roof. Technically, it's the Elizabeth Samuel Garden. And it was actually constructed partly, I think, by in line with City of Ontario requirements of requiring green roofs and surface green space. So a lot of people, you don't see it from the street level. It's not an obvious outward thing, but it's actually a really valuable, great opportunity to see how even ROM plays a role within the City of Toronto, and how you have these larger societal level scales that are now coming to play and making ROM have this really amazing green roof, which is also a supporting place for biodiversity. It's been a place of research for bat research here. There's a lot of different elements that come together, and it's reducing the urban heat island effect. So these green roofs that are coming through at societal scales are also being able to echo within the institutional scales and the staff who are here. So with that kind of preamble, I was again hired here a few years ago. This is a picture of myself on my first day of work with Alan Schiff and Josh. And it was, again, September 2021, so I think we just took off the masks for about 10 seconds and then put them on again and spread apart. But it was an endowed inaugural curatorship. So it's kind of an interesting role that I stepped into. As far as we know, it's the first of its kind, actually, anywhere in the world, have a place that has a curator for climate change. And I know some people tied it in with this idea of a 21st century museum, saying this is a new kind of curator. It wasn't really a clear guideline in terms of how closely it was going to be tied into traditional curatorial practices. But one of the first things that came up was that there was an expectation that if a museum is going to have a curator of climate change, what is that museum doing also about climate change itself? So are we able to say that this is going beyond just speaking about climate change, but actually taking some kind of action on it? And of course, as David had mentioned in the introduction, my background is actually as a limnologist. I study lakes and climate change interactions. So I didn't have a lot of knowledge about, I should say I had essentially zero knowledge about facilities of major museums or a large museum. But that is what opened up in the conversation with the people, the conservators here, the facilities, to even understand, if we're going to talk about global climate change, what about the climate even within the museum? And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Heidi, who is the head of conservation at the museum, to talk a little bit about that and what she also taught me.
Thank you, Soren. Don't go too far because I don't know how to advance the slide. It's this one, I guess. Okay. Welcome. Ubiquitous with museums and galleries is the notion of climate control. Climate control is the manipulation of HVAC systems to tailor temperature, humidity, fresh air, and circulation so that optimal conditions are created to maintain the stability of our artwork, objects, and specimens. ROM buildings are an amalgam of edifices from 1912, 1932, 1978, and 2007. Each of these buildings have unique HVAC demands, largely as a result of building materials, gallery placement, and age of infrastructure. In 1977, ROM began to get museum climate under control. This was 1 year before the 1978 publication by Gary Thompson entitled The Museum Environment. For over 40 years, we have abided by the edict of 50% relative humidity and 21 degrees Celsius, as outlined in that publication. Conservators have seen these not only as recommendations, but even so much as the gold standard of museum climate. I even have the t-shirt, 50% RH, 21 degrees Celsius. Thompson, however, set these numbers based on the performance of HVAC systems, not the expectations of museum climate. I'll repeat that. These numbers are based on the performance of HVAC systems, not the expectations of the museum climate. But here's the reality. For decades, we have struggled to maintain these parameters, or attain them in some cases. More so when we see institutions in other climates that cannot even contemplate such set points, a Bermuda Art Gallery or a Nordic History Museum. And now, climate change. Climate change further strains these objectives. In response to our changing climate, museums are beginning to rethink our strategies in very practical fashions. The Bizot Green Protocol, updated in 2023, introduces museums to principles surrounding the reduction of energy consumption, which is well known to affect climate change. Embedded in the protocol is also a change to these set points for institutions, wider ranges of set points, between 40 and 60% relative humidity, and 16 to 25 degrees Celsius. And how do we control museum climate? I like to think of it as two main camps, Camp HVAC and Camp Passive Methods. Camp HVAC relies on mechanical heating, cooling, chilling, condensing, reheating, and circulation of air. It does so based on defined set points, running headlong into system shutdowns, gallery visitors, who can introduce humidity from things like wet parkas or snowy knit hats, and of course are increasingly demanding climate change. But there is a silver lining. The cheapest way to control climate is by focusing on dehumidification without temperature control. Well, what does that mean? Essentially, making places like storage spaces focused on humidity control and not so much temperature, which is largely dictated by human comfort. And the most critical goal of museum climate must be the reduction of fluctuations. It is the fluctuations that largely cause the most amount of damage, not high-end or low-end climate settings. Camp Passive Methods is where we get really creative, and by thinking a little bit more about legacy solutions. Bizot's wider set points help us and our loan partners. Physical attributes like door sweeps, airlocks. That's when you open a door, you're in a vestibule, then you open another door. And climate-driven object placement. This is built on our knowledge about the facts of the museum. Inner galleries have less temperature and relative humidity fluctuations. And perhaps the new member to the camp, AI. Artificial intelligence uses data from building automation systems, which can anticipate hourly demands based on the history of the system, and also then head them off at the pass. It folds in exterior weather reports to modulate those HVAC systems even further, proactive versus reactive. ROM is currently a participant in a pilot study with Key Futures entitled Getting Climate Control Under Control. Key Futures is a global-based museum sustainability organization based in the Netherlands. This 18-month study, which is about to complete in April of this year, is intended to provide the collective museum sector a more inclusive and updated approach to museum climate set points, as well as adopting new cost-saving energy strategies. Our ROM team consists of ROM champions, which has resulted in a dynamic group playing active roles in these innovations. The Key program also introduced us to allies throughout the globe, from museum staff in smaller, mid-sized institutions globally, as they detail the necessity for inclusivity in loan arrangements, to librarians in Denmark, who now adhere to humidity-focused climate rules, which means they have a whole rack of guest sweaters that you get to put on, stationed just outside their 15-degree storage vaults. The Key program has raised awareness of what needs to be done, from making museum loans more accessible to those smaller and mid-sized institutions, as well as our larger institutions that we work with, that have been historically shut out by those narrow climate parameters, to emphasizing that ROM has a leadership role to play. As the largest museum in Canada, simply put, we need to be the example of how to respond to climate change. And as Soren has been demonstrating, we are. Key taught us and showed us the value in cross-departmental participation and the demystification of museum climate, that upgrading our infrastructure will make us nimbler about energy savings and climate harm. We aren't seeking to relax standards, but rather upgrade them. Back to Soren.
So, a few things. I wanted to kind of jump then from this idea of the climate control, speaking about our Key Futures program, and jump back into a few of the higher level and the other kinds of levels of things that we're doing at the museum, thinking about this moving forward. We have thought about carbon footprint reductions. This is the amount of greenhouse gases associated with operations of a facility. And for instance, in England, it's been law for a while now that all institutions, cultural institutions, have to report every year their carbon footprint. In respect for that, there was a climate change project coordinator, Sarah Kamau, who was hired the first 2 years that I was here on contract, who made these baseline carbon footprint calculations during that time. So we're starting to get kind of ahead of that ball, looking at what might be happening here. And started actually in the first year that I was here and that Sarah was here as well. We reached out to the team called Transform TO. They are working in Metro Hall, working for the city to bring the city of Toronto to net zero, but within Toronto's projected guidelines, I think by 2040, 2045. And we brought them here, invited them to go through the museum, take a tour of the museum facilities, thinking about how we can work together, how the city and the museum can partner in terms of thinking of reducing our carbon footprint. And then more recently, we've actually been consulting and worked with the Hatch engineering firm to help create a guideline in terms of how it would work moving forward, how a museum could reduce its carbon footprint. And this figure I have here is actually taken from their latest report. And it's nothing to really, the main reason I wanted to include it, and we don't have to go through each of the different sort of colors there in the details, but to show that, that the idea of reducing a carbon footprint is actually multifaceted and complicated, much more than I think people tend to kind of consider it might be when you start. You almost think about it as being as easy as turning off the lights, but when it comes down to, part of that, the gray area there is a link between University of Toronto. So University of Toronto's carbon footprint ties into ours in terms of steam generation, which links to the humidity controls in the building. A part of it in yellow is Toronto Hydroelectricity. So what the province does in terms of its carbon footprint will influence what the imprint of our electricity consumption is. And then you have gray, which could be gas, and then there's questions of whether we source gas from renewable sources, such as taken from landfills and generated methane from those sites. So there's a lot of kind of pieces of these puzzles that come together, but we can see that there's an overall pathway that we can take, that we can start piecing together, again, that works with both our neighboring institutions, connections with university, and also connections with the province, connections with the city, and connections within the institutions, and across departments as facilitated, for instance, through the Green Team meetings. Beyond that decarbonizing, though, I think that a really important role that the museum can play is this bridge as a community space and as a government space. So we are kind of in a really amazing spot, I think, that's also not all museums internationally are in this kind of a position where they're both parts of government and they have that really valuable community voice to them. So if anyone has a chance even later today to run up to the Tech Gallery, this is an image from a new case that we've just installed there last week, actually, looking at critical minerals. And I think, it's one of the first things and one of my favorite things right now in the museum that speaks to how we can, as museums or as cultural institutions, institute cultural changes and having different conversations about climate change. So again, walking the walk and then talking and having new conversations that we're bringing to the front. We've also been doing this through exhibitions already. Noel Hamlin Lifers was one of the first ones that I was involved with. We're working now on one on Crawford Lake. And yeah, again, this critical minerals net zero case, which really focuses on the concept of, what kind of a community do we want to live in, and how do critical minerals play a role in that, and what does it look like in terms of the expanded choices that you have in net zero societies, the different options of ways to get around. And I think that that's a really important sort of reframing and messaging. So again, this overarching goal, and that echoes what Heidi was saying, is in terms of putting ROM at the center as this bridge institution. That's, I think, the most critical and exciting place for me as a climate change curator to be working in, but also thinking of the sustainability of the institution as part of that. And I'm going to leave it at that. I think we're already over time and everyone's probably thirsty for coffee. But I think that this multi-scalar aspect is what's important also for the Museum for Ontario, thinking about stories about how, for instance, Ontario has the largest climate change mitigation action on the continent by phasing out coal, which improved our air quality, and how the Portland's Flood Protection Project is the largest urban climate adaptation project on the planet. And a lot of people don't know these different stories. So these are also things that we can use, again, through our community role to highlight what the government is doing and what our society is doing. And I will leave it at that. Thank you. Everyone enjoy the coffee break, and maybe have time for one question.
Any questions?
Maybe have time for a question if anyone. Yeah, I see one. Not to walk on it. There was a restaurant there, and I don't know what the plans are, that would look over the green roof. At this point, it's not safe for groups to walk on, so it's not designed for that much weight to go on it. Oh, yes?
You can look out at it from C5, and it is something that at times the DMV has offered tours for. But we've never been able to, one of the things about green roofs is that there's a loading capacity. And so the plants actually that are up there now are exceeding the loading capacity. So we've never been able to have people on that roof.
Just bees.
Yeah, hi. I was curious what you guys are looking at for the next big initiative for improving sustainability within the facility, whether it's looking at district heating and cooling and improving the efficiency there, or I guess just what's pushing you towards making that decision as well, whether it's a more stringent building standard or outside influence. Yeah.
I'm glad you asked that. Actually, one of the things that I meant to mention and I forgot to include here is we're actually upgrading right now to a hybrid HVAC system in the museum. Hybrid heat pump system. So that's something that's a pretty major change right now, which is we're expecting to have huge increases in efficiencies for electricity. And then I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, that heat pump.
Yeah, so the heat pump is a really big deal. I would say beyond that too. I mean, part of, we've had conversations, for instance, with TTC about using potentially air from there for geothermal exchange. Again, a lot of the questions come to these conversations of who's ready for what are the engineering capacities, what are the time capacity in a given day of engineers and institutions. So, I mean, that's something that, again, we got as an idea from London that museums have started doing there. So I think there's many ongoing conversations that are going to keep on happening, and it's going to be a work in progress.
And every opportunity we get when a piece of HVAC equipment reaches its end life, that is a great opportunity. What is the best, most responsible, most sustainable energy saving that we can incorporate? So that we take real good advantage of those opportunities.
Okay, thank you so much.